Thought by experts to be the best tuned engine in the world, no wonder Cosworth showed interest in the famous Alfa Romeo V6 engine. Unofficially known as the Busso, there are tons of iconic and legendary engines from all corners of the world, but when it holds its engineer's name, it is not just a story of an engine. It is known as the world's best sounding V6, and there isn't a Busso article not mentioning its glorious sound. The man was called Giuseppe Busso, and being an industrial engineer, he spent his early days at Fiat. After leaving Fiat, he soon joined Alfa Romeo, which saw great potential in the man. During the Second World War, he became unemployed. Back then, Enzo Ferrari wanted a new engine and asked then Alfa Romeo engine designer Gioacchino Colombo to build him a motor. He agreed to do it in secret and suggested putting Busso in charge of supervising the development. Enzo got his V12. Colombo was from then on a full-time employee at Ferrari, and Alfa Romeo instantly invited Busso to return in 1948. Giuseppe designed an Alfa Romeo twin-cam 4-cylinder, which proved as a step in the right direction. However, the twin-cam could not provide enough power for more performance-oriented models, and the company started thinking about a large displacement engine. Busso and his team would start working on it in the late 60s. A near production-ready concept engine was finished in 1973, but unfortunately for Alfa and Busso, the project had to be postponed due to an ongoing oil crisis. The engine would wait over half a decade to finally be produced. Around this same time, when Busso was at the age of 64, he retired in 1977. But fear not, he had still been developing the engine for Alfa. In 1979, the newly developed V6 began as a 156 horsepower over-squared 6-cylinder having single overhead cam heads, 12 valves and 6 individual carburetors Dell'Orto FRPA 40. Many features of the twin cam could be found in it: hemispherical combustion chambers, all aluminum construction, iron wet liners, a forged steel crankshaft, and later, the twin-cam setup. The beauty of Alfa's belt-driven single overhead cam was that the intake valves were directly pushed by the camshafts on top of them, and the sodium-filled exhaust valves were managed by rocker arms and small pushrods. For this reason, the exhaust valves required tighter clearance on the buckets to work properly, 0.22 to 0.25 mm versus 0.45 mm on the intake side. The engine had large 88 mm wide cylinders with a relatively short stroke of 68.3 mm. Such an over-squared ratio is normally seen on high-performance, high-revving engines like in Ducatis, Ferraris or Porsches, as it favors a revvy character. But this was a road-going engine for the masses, hence it was interesting to see that it was still strong enough at low revs and able to impress owners and the press. While other competing brands were slowly getting into fuel injection, mechanical or electronic, Alfa Romeo could not sacrifice throttle response, and no injection system at the time could support ITBs, so they chose to go the carburetor way. It did not take long before the Bosch Algetronic electronic fuel injection was released with a modernized engine in the Alfa Romeo 6. This was the time when the engine was longitudinally mounted in the Alfa Romeo 6, 75, 90 and the Alfetta GT V6, which actually had a transmission at the back as a transaxle. A 2-liter was introduced in 1983 until 1987 and was meant as an entry-level unit, made with both carburetors and fuel injection. In 1985, the 2.5-liter was later upgraded by Autodelta, Alfa's former racing department with an increased bore and stroke. The newly developed 3-liter had 2,939 cc of displacement with unique carbs and cams, making 176 horsepower into GT-V6 3.0 SA. Only 176 examples with hand-built engines were made, retrofitted from the original 2.5s. Alfa liked the larger engine and decided to build their original 3-liter, 2,959cc to be exact, to boost sales of the Milano in the USA, the European 75. It too featured the single overhead cam setup, but used a slightly longer stroke of 72.6 compared to the 72mm Auto Delta engine. The Algetronic was used instead and gave the engine the ability to make up to 210 horsepower in the spiciest trim, the Alfa Romeo SZ. The 3-liter was also modified for placement in a transverse engine bay for upcoming models like 164. The 164 introduced the famous chrome long intake runners, which were a necessary modification for a bonnet clearance. A special version of the 12-valve was a 2-liter turbo. This one was sourced out of a 3-liter 12-valve using 80 by 66.2mm large cylinders. The main reason for the turbo variant's existence was an Italian tax penalty on engine displacements about 2000 cc, and thanks to forced induction, it could provide 3 liters output with torque peak at 2100 rpm. In 1993, a major revision was introduced with twin overhead camshafts now operating 24 valves in total. The 12-valve was easier to change spark plugs in, whereas 24-valve iterations require an intake plenum removal. Regardless of the higher service difficulty, the engine was more eager for revs and made a high horsepower output. The first one was a 3-liter in the 164 with 210 horsepower and 232 horsepower in the Quadrifoglio Verde, later followed by the Lancia Kappa and Alfa Romeo GTV. Then in 1996, a smaller 2.5 came to the world using the same bore and stroke dimensions of the single overhead cam unit. The only models equipped with it were the 156 and 166. Its power ranged from 188 to 192 horsepower, and it won the International Engine of the Year award in 2000. The swan song of the Busso was a 3.2-liter. Initially introduced in a 147 and 156 GTA, they both received a 250 horsepower engine, and it was detuned to 240 horsepower for the 166, GTV and GT. A 230 horsepower version of the 3.2 was used in the Lancia Thesis. As a honorable mention, there was a further tuning of the 3.2 by Auto Delta, increasing the displacement to 3.7 liter, and there was even a supercharged version of it. Then it was either 328 horsepower or over 400, all going to front wheels via an LSD. For all Busso engines, the crankshaft was forged and fully counterweighted with 9 weights. Connecting rods were also forged, and interestingly, all were of the same size for any displacement. They were merged to large cast aluminum pistons ranging from 80 to 93 mm in diameter, and for the 2-liter, they were narrower than the rods. The 2-liter requires a liner removal, installing the piston from underneath, and then reinstalling the whole cylinder inside the block. The engine is mechanically pretty solid and well built, with not many design errors or failing points. The first turbocharged models had ancient engine management regarding fuel mixture control and were able to knock themselves to death even with a working knock sensor. Later models in the 166 with an intake temperature sensor and an improved ECU brain were able to prevent a total engine failure. The Busso engine requires a new timing belt every 60,000 kilometers. Regular oil changes and valve adjustments are needed in variants with solid lifters. It is known to consume gasoline at a rapid pace, but people don't buy a gasoline Italian for fuel consumption. There is a guy on Classic Alpha forum who compared a 12-valve and a 24-valve block, and they seem to be nearly identical, making the 24-valve almost easy to retrofit into older longitudinally oriented platforms. An interesting finding is that it is possible to use 3-liter 12-valve pistons with a 2.5-liter 24-valve crankshaft to lower the compression ratio, making a more ideal combination for an aftermarket turbo. It could possibly be a non-interference engine too. A major problem would be the oil pump, the pickup and the drive cock, possibly able to be fixed with a dry sump setup and a spacer replacement for the cock. Last but not least, there was one more engine somehow related to the Busso V6. Between 1993 and 1996, Alfa raced in DTM and had to use a production engine block with the same bang angle for the race motor. Hence, for the 1993 season, the 60-degree aluminum design was used with a dry sump system and a 4-valve setup, including titanium intake valves. The engine weighed only 110 kilograms, compared to the 170 kilogram heavy 2.5-liter single overhead cam, and made 420 horsepower at 11,800 rpm. A 1996 engine had up to 490 horsepower, but it was a completely different unit that was allegedly loosely based on the PRV 90-degree V6 series. This engine plays a symphony every time it gets into revs, and its hunger for RPM is known to be insatiable. The whole story could not be more poetic, as Giuseppe Busso died just 3 days after his engine ceased production forever in 2005. There are not that many iconic V6 laying around, and Busso is deemed to be the greatest V6 engine ever.